I ain't marrying that fat black woman. The giant cowboy roared as cards scattered across the saloon table. But the debt was settled and the bet was final. Cowboy forced to marry obese black woman after losing bet, and she was perfect. The seamstress with hands like gentle thunder had weathered their whispers for years, dismissed as nothing more than charity case destined for spinsterhood. Now the whole town snickered, watching the arrogant ranch heir stumble toward his supposed punishment. But beneath her modest dress, and behind those knowing eyes lay secrets that could transform their struggling frontier community, or destroy it completely. The dead father's locked study held answers neither spouse suspected, while powerful men from back east circled like vultures, sensing opportunity in the town's desperation. Would this arranged union of two unlikely souls save them both, or would buried truths tear apart everything they'd never known they needed? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The cards hit the table with finality. Seth Hargrove stared at his losing hand while the traveling gambler's gold teeth gleamed in the lamplight. Around the dusty dollar saloon, faces pressed closer to witness his downfall. Terms were clear, cowboy. Marry the woman we pick or forfeit your ranch. The gambler's finger pointed through the window toward the seamstress shop across the dusty street. That one there, Josephine Abbott. Seth's stomach dropped. Every eye in Millbrook followed that pointing finger to the large black woman bent over her sewing. Snickers rippled through the crowd like wildfire. 30 days to wed, or you lose everything your daddy left you. The gambler collected his winnings. Debts are debts. The saloon erupted in laughter. Seth stumbled into the street, his world spinning. 3 generations of Hargrove sweat had built that ranch. Now one foolish bet had reduced him to this. Josephine Abbott looked up from her work as Boots approached her shop. She had heard the commotion from across the street. In Millbrook, news traveled faster than prairie wind. Miss Abbott. Seth removed his hat, his face burning with shame. I need to speak with you. Jo set down her needle. She had delivered half the babies in this town and sewn dresses for the other half. She knew every secret Millbrook held, including Seth Hargrove's gambling problem. About the bet, I assume. Seth nodded, unable to meet her eyes. Jo studied this man who had never spoken to her before today. Tall and broad-shouldered, with hands that shook from too much whiskey and eyes that avoided reality. The choice is yours, Mr. Hargrove. I won't force any man into marriage. It ain't about forcing. Seth's voice cracked. It's about keeping my father's ranch. Jo understood. The Hargrove spread was the largest in the county. Losing it would make Seth nothing more than a drifter. She also understood what this marriage would mean for her. A roof over her head, but a lifetime of resentment underneath it. Very well, but know this. I won't be treated like a burden you carry. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the small church at the edge of town. Only a handful attended. Sheriff Eli Barston stood in the back, arms crossed, watching with disapproval. Elma Griffin clutched her purse in the front pew, eyes darting nervously between the unlikely couple. Reverend Mills rushed through the ceremony like a man eager to finish an unpleasant chore. Seth mumbled his vows. Jo spoke hers clearly, with dignity that silenced the few witnesses present. After the brief service, Seth helped Jo into his wagon. The ride to the ranch passed in uncomfortable silence. Jo stared at the rolling hills that would now be her home. Seth stared at anywhere but his new wife. The Hargrove Ranch house sat weathered and neglected, paint peeled from the shutters. The front porch sagged under years of deferred maintenance. Jo climbed down from the wagon and surveyed her new domain. I'll sleep in the barn, Seth announced, grabbing his bedroll. As you wish. Jo lifted her single trunk from the wagon bed. But the house needs work and I intend to see it gets done. Seth paused. This ain't permanent, just until I figure something else out. Jo said nothing. She had learned long ago that actions spoke louder than words, especially when dealing with stubborn men. The next morning, Jo rose before dawn. She found the kitchen filthy and bare. The pantry held only beans, hardtack, and a bottle of whiskey. She rolled up her sleeves and began scrubbing. Seth stumbled in hours later, hungover and defensive. Joe had transformed the kitchen. Clean surfaces gleamed. Fresh bread cooled on the windowsill. Coffee bubbled in the pot. "Didn't ask you to do all this," he muttered. "Didn't ask permission." Joe poured him coffee. "Drink this, then show me the rest of the property." Seth wanted to refuse, but the coffee smelled better than anything he had tasted in months. He drank it while Joe watched with knowing eyes. The tour revealed the ranch's problems. Fences needed mending. Cattle wandered unfenced pastures. The barn leaked. Seth's father had been gone 2 years, and Seth had let everything slide into ruin. "How many head?" Joe asked, studying the scattered livestock. "Maybe 200, hard to say with them spread so thin." Joe nodded. She understood numbers better than most. Years of measuring fabric and calculating costs had sharpened her mathematical mind. "What about the north pasture?" She pointed toward a section of land that seemed unused. Seth's expression darkened. "Pa spent years digging holes up there. Claimed he'd find silver. Never found nothing but rocks and debt." Joe filed this information away. She had noticed Seth's reluctance to discuss his father's activities. The locked study in the house suggested secrets yet uncovered. Over the following days, Joe continued her quiet improvements. She mended clothes and organized supplies. She cooked proper meals instead of the beans and whiskey Seth had survived on. Each small change made the house more livable. The townspeople watched with cruel amusement. At the general store, women whispered behind gloved hands. Men made jokes about Seth's punishment getting worse every day. Joe endured their stares and whispers. She had weathered worse storms than small-town gossip, but she also began to notice things during her trips to town. Families struggling financially, properties being sold to distant buyers, fear in people's eyes when they mentioned the future. Something was happening in Millbrook. Something that reached beyond her awkward marriage to a desperate cowboy. And Joe suspected the answers lay hidden somewhere in her new home. The whiskey bottle sat empty on the kitchen table when Joe entered at sunrise. Seth slumped in his chair, still wearing yesterday's clothes. The coffee she had left him remained untouched and cold. "The fence in the east pasture collapsed again," she said, hanging her shawl on the peg. "Lost 3 head through the gap." Seth didn't look up. "Not your concern." "It is now." Joe moved around the kitchen, starting her morning routine. "This ranch is my home too, whether you like it or not." Seth finally raised his head. His eyes were bloodshot and angry. "Your home. You think because some preacher said words over us, this place belongs to you." Joe paused in her bread making. Something had shifted overnight. Seth's resentment had curdled into something sharper. "I think a wife has a right to care about her husband's property." "Wife." Seth spat the word like poison. "You ain't my wife. You're just the price I pay for my stupidity." The words hung in the air between them. Joe continued kneading dough, her movements steady despite the sting. She had heard worse, but coming from the man she had begun to help, it cut deeper than expected. "Then perhaps you should have thought harder before gambling away your inheritance." Seth slammed his fist on the table. "Don't you dare lecture me about my father's ranch. You don't know nothing about what he built here. I know it's falling apart while you drink yourself senseless." "Maybe it should fall apart." Seth stood unsteadily. "Maybe I should just walk away from all of it. The ranch, the debt, this whole situation." Joe turned to face him fully. "And go where? Do what? You're not built for drifting, Seth Hargrove. This land is in your blood." "You don't know what's in my blood." The conversation ended when Seth stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Joe watched through the window as he saddled his horse and rode toward town. She knew where he was headed. Back to the dusty dollar, back to the bottle that promised easy answers. Joe finished her bread in silence. Then she did something she had been considering for days. She walked to the locked study at the back of the house. The door had remained sealed since Seth's father died. Seth avoided it like a shameful secret. But Joe had noticed his glances toward it, the way his jaw tightened whenever she cleaned nearby. The lock was old but sturdy. Joe retrieved her sewing kit and selected a thin metal tool. Years of delicate needlework had given her nimble fingers. The lock clicked open on her third attempt. The study door swung wide, revealing a room frozen in time. Dust particles danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through grimy windows. Papers covered every surface. Maps hung on the walls. Books in multiple languages filled the shelves. Jo stepped inside, her heart racing. This was no ordinary rancher's office. This was the workspace of an educated man, a scholar even. She approached the large desk at the center of the room. Charts and surveys spread across its surface, held down by rocks serving as paperweights. Jo lifted the first document and felt her breath catch. The papers were covered in notations written in Spanish, French, and English. Technical terms she recognized from her secret reading filled the margins. But most striking were the detailed maps showing the land beneath Millbrook and the surrounding ranches. Jo had taught herself languages during long winter nights, using books given to her by the sympathetic wife of a former employer. The woman had recognized Jo's hunger for knowledge and quietly fed it with discarded volumes. Mathematics had come naturally from years of calculating fabric measurements and construction patterns. Now those hidden skills revealed the truth Seth's father had died protecting. The maps showed geological surveys of unprecedented detail, mineral deposits marked in careful notation, test drilling results recorded with scientific precision, and running like a golden thread beneath the town and surrounding properties, a massive silver vein. Jo sank into the desk chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the discovery. This was not the desperate scrabbling of a failed prospector. This was the methodical work of a trained geologist who had found something extraordinary. She studied the surveys more carefully. The silver deposit stretched beneath most of Millbrook's residential area and extended out to cover portions of at least 6 major ranches, including the Hargrove spread. The potential value was staggering, but other documents in the pile revealed troubling information. Land ownership records showed discrepancies between what families believed they owned and what legal papers claimed. Many properties appeared to be controlled by an Eastern investment company called Millfield Holdings. Jo's mind raced as she connected the pieces. Seth's father had discovered silver beneath the town, but he had also discovered that the people living above it might not legally own their land. The knowledge had died with him, locked away in this forgotten room. Outside, she heard Seth's horse returning. Jo quickly gathered the most important documents and returned the rest to their original positions. She locked the study door and hurried to the kitchen, her mind spinning with possibilities. Seth stumbled through the front door, more drunk than when he had left. He collapsed into his chair without acknowledging Jo's presence. "We need to talk," Jo said quietly. "Nothing to talk about." Seth's words slurred together. "Decided you were right. This place ain't worth saving." Jo placed the maps on the table in front of him. Seth stared at them through bleary eyes, his expression slowly shifting from confusion to shock. "Where did you get these?" "Your father's study." Jo sat across from him. "I can read them, Seth, all of them. Spanish, French, English. I know what they mean." Seth reached for the papers with trembling hands. "He made me promise never to go in there, said it would only bring trouble. Your father found silver, enough to make everyone in this county rich." The words sobered Seth instantly. He studied the maps with new understanding, seeing his father's work through different eyes. If this is true, why didn't he tell anyone? Jo pointed to the land ownership documents. Because he discovered something else, something that could destroy lives if the wrong people found out. Seth stared at the documents spread before him, his drunken haze evaporating with each passing moment. The careful notations in his father's handwriting told a story he had never imagined. "How long have you been able to read these languages?" he asked. "Since I was 16. Jo traced a finger along one of the survey lines. "Mrs. Patterson gave me books when her husband wasn't looking, said it was a shame to waste a mind that wanted to learn." Seth had never heard of the Pattersons, but then again, he had never paid attention to Jo's life before their forced union. The realization stung more than he expected. Pa always said his mining was just foolish dreams. Seth picked up a geological report. Town folk laughed at him for years. Your father was protecting them. Joe pointed to the ownership documents. Look at these land deeds. Most families think they own their property outright, but the legal papers tell a different story. Seth studied the official records Joe had found mixed with the mining surveys. Property after property showed the same pattern. Original homestead claims had been transferred to Millfield Holdings through a series of complex transactions that most residents had never understood. They don't actually own their land. Legally, no. They're essentially tenants who think they're landowners. Joe gathered the most damning documents. If word of this silver discovery reaches the wrong people, these families will be evicted overnight. The weight of the knowledge settled on Seth's shoulders. His father had carried this burden alone for years, knowing that revealing the silver would destroy the community he was trying to protect. What do we do with this information? Joe met his eyes directly. We make sure the right people benefit from it, not some Eastern company that stole the land through legal trickery. For the first time since their wedding, Seth saw Joe not as his burden but as his partner. Her intelligence blazed in her dark eyes, and her determination reminded him of his father's quiet strength. You have a plan. The beginning of one. Joe spread out a township map. First, we need to understand exactly which properties sit over the silver vein. Then we research the legal history of each land transfer. Seth nodded, feeling more focused than he had in months. Pa kept correspondence files in the back cabinet. Might be useful. They worked through the night, piecing together the scope of both the silver discovery and the land fraud. Joe's mathematical skills proved invaluable in calculating potential mineral yields. Seth provided local knowledge about property boundaries and family histories. By sunrise, they had mapped out the full extent of the conspiracy. Millfield Holdings controlled nearly 60% of the township through questionable legal maneuvers spanning 2 decades. We can't fight this alone, Seth said, rubbing his tired eyes. We won't be alone. Joe gathered the evidence into neat piles. I visit every house in this county as a seamstress and midwife. People trust me with their secrets. They'll listen if I approach this carefully. Seth studied his wife with new respect. Joe had been building relationships throughout the community while he had been drowning his sorrows in whiskey. She understood the social fabric of Millbrook better than he ever had. Where do we start? With the families who have the most to lose. Joe pointed to several properties on the map. The Donnellys, the Washingtons, the Kleins, all sitting on prime silver deposits, all vulnerable to immediate eviction. Over the following week, Joe began her careful campaign. She visited homes under the pretense of delivering clothing alterations and checking on new mothers. During these visits, she gently raised questions about land ownership and family legal documents. The conversations revealed disturbing patterns. Many families had been pressured to sign documents they couldn't read, told they were simple property tax arrangements. Others had been convinced to take loans against their land during hard times, never realizing they were surrendering ownership rights. Seth threw himself into ranch work with renewed purpose. The physical labor helped him think clearly for the first time in years. He mended fences, rounded up scattered cattle, and repaired buildings that had suffered from his neglect. Neighbors began to notice the changes. The Hargrove spread looked prosperous again. Seth appeared sober and focused. Most surprising of all, the unlikely marriage seemed to be working. Never thought I'd see Seth Hargrove taking advice from his wife, commented Tom Donnelly when he stopped by to examine a bull Seth wanted to sell. Good advice is good advice, regardless of the source, Seth replied, glancing toward the house where Joe was teaching Donnelly's youngest daughter to read. But their investigation hadn't gone unnoticed. Sheriff Barston began appearing at the ranch more frequently, asking pointed questions about Joe's activities around town. Folks say your wife's been mighty curious about property deeds lately, Barston said during one visit. Seems odd behavior for a seamstress. Joe takes interest in the community, Seth replied carefully. Nothing wrong with that, Depends on the kind of interest. Barston's eyes narrowed. Some interests can cause trouble for people who don't know their place. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Seth felt his temper flare, but Joe's gentle touch on his arm reminded him to stay calm. After Barston left, Joe shared troubling news from town. Elma Griffin had mentioned seeing well-dressed strangers asking questions at the hotel. The general store owner reported inquiries about local property values. Someone was taking interest in Millbrook. "Word is getting out," Joe said. "We need to move faster." That evening, they made a crucial decision. Joe would accelerate her outreach to vulnerable families, while Seth researched legal options. They would also need allies beyond Millbrook, people with the power to challenge Millfield Holdings in court. Joe had already identified a possibility. Her correspondence with a federal land rights attorney in the territorial capital had begun as a general inquiry about homestead law. Now it might become their lifeline. "There's something else we need to discuss," Joe said as they planned their next moves. "This partnership we've built, it's changed things between us." Seth nodded, understanding her meaning. Somewhere between the late nights over legal documents and the shared purpose of protecting their community, their marriage had transformed from arrangement to alliance. It has. Neither spoke the word love, but it hung in the air between them like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. The strangers arrived on a Tuesday morning in a dust-covered carriage that screamed money and authority. Crawford Thorne stepped onto Millbrook's Main Street wearing a tailored suit that cost more than most families earned in a year. Two associates flanked him, carrying leather satchels and the cold expressions of men accustomed to getting their way. Word spread through town faster than wildfire. By noon, everyone knew that Eastern investors had come calling. By evening, the first families had received unexpected visits with generous offers to purchase their properties. Joe watched from the general store as Thorne emerged from the Donnelly house. Tom Donnelly's face was pale, his wife clutching a document with shaking hands. The offer was substantial enough to solve their immediate financial problems, but Joe knew the true value of what lay beneath their land. "Mighty generous folks, those Eastern businessmen," Sheriff Barston commented, appearing beside Joe at the store window. "Offering good money for properties that ain't worth much." "Depends on what you know about their true worth," Joe replied carefully. Barston's eyes narrowed. "Seems like you might know more than most folks around here. Been asking a lot of questions lately." Joe met his stare directly. "Knowledge isn't a crime, Sheriff. Neither is keeping the peace. Sometimes that means making sure certain people don't stir up trouble where none existed before." The threat was clear. Joe nodded politely and continued her shopping, but her mind raced with urgency. Thorne's arrival meant their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. That evening, she found Seth in the barn, aggressively mucking stalls. His movements betrayed the anger he was trying to control. "The Kleins signed," he said without looking up. "Took Thorne's offer this afternoon." Joe's heart sank. The Klein property sat directly over one of the richest parts of the Silver Vein. "Did you try to warn them?" "Couldn't get close. Thorne's men were there all day helping them pack." Seth threw down his shovel. "They think they struck it rich with that buyout offer." "How many others?" "3 more families considering, maybe 4. Seth finally met her eyes. "We're losing them, Joe. They see quick money and don't understand what they're giving up." Joe leaned against the barn door, calculating rapidly. If Thorne acquired enough key properties, he could block any community effort to challenge the broader land fraud. The families would be scattered to the winds, and Millfield Holdings would control both the silver and the people who should rightfully benefit from it. "We need to accelerate our timeline," she said. "No more careful approaches. We tell people the truth directly." Seth nodded grimly. "Even if it means admitting we've been investigating behind their backs. Especially then, trust matters more than pride right now." The next morning, Joe made an unprecedented decision. Instead of her usual discreet house visits, she posted a notice at the church asking all interested families to gather for a community meeting. The notice mentioned important information about property rights and local mineral discoveries. The response was immediate and mixed. Some families arrived early, curious about Joe's unusual public invitation. Others stayed away, intimidated by Sheriff Barston's visible disapproval of the gathering. Elma Griffin surprised Joe by arriving first, bringing two of her neighbors. The timid woman had been slowly warming to Joe over the past weeks, and now she showed unexpected courage in defying social pressure. "Heard you got something important to say," Elma said quietly. "Time somebody spoke up around here." When the meeting began, Joe faced a room of 23 adults representing most of Millbrook's established families. Sheriff Barston lurked in the back, arms crossed and expression hostile. Tom Donnelly sat in the front row, still clutching the contract Thorne had presented to him. Joe began with the silver discovery, spreading Seth's father's maps on a table where everyone could see them. Gasps rippled through the crowd as she explained the geological surveys and mineral assessments. "This is what lies beneath our community," she said, pointing to the detailed notations. "Enough silver to make every family in this room prosperous for generations." "If that's true," called out Martha Washington, "why didn't Samuel Hargrove tell anyone?" Seth stepped forward, his voice steady despite the crowd's attention. "Because he discovered something else. Something that would have put all of you in immediate danger." Joe unveiled the land ownership documents. The room fell silent as she explained the legal fraud that had transferred most properties to Millfield Holdings without the residents' knowledge or understanding. "You mean we don't actually own our homes?" Tom Donnelly's voice cracked. "Not according to these legal documents," Joe confirmed. "You've been paying taxes and making improvements on land that was stolen from you through fraudulent paperwork." The silence stretched until Martha Washington stood up, her face blazing with anger. 20 years I've been working that land. 20 years of believing it would pass to my children." Similar outbursts erupted throughout the room. Families realized they had been systematically cheated, their life's work reduced to tenancy through legal manipulation they never understood. Sheriff Barston chose that moment to interrupt. "This is all very interesting, but you folks are getting worked up over speculation and old papers. Maybe you should be listening to real opportunities instead of fairy tales about silver mines." Fairy tales. Seth pulled out a sample of silver ore his father had extracted during testing. The metal gleamed in the lamplight, undeniable proof of the discovery's reality. The crowd pressed closer to examine the ore. Joe watched their expressions shift from skepticism to amazement to determination. These were hardworking people who had built lives from nothing. Learning they had been robbed ignited a fire that surprised even her. "What do we do about it?" demanded Tom Donnelly, tearing up Thorne's contract. Joe smiled. This was the moment she had been preparing for since discovering the documents. "We fight back, together. I've been corresponding with a federal attorney who specializes in land fraud cases. He's willing to take our case if we can present sufficient evidence." "What kind of evidence?" asked Elma Griffin. "The kind I've been collecting for weeks. Original homestead documents, family records, proof of fraudulent transfers. Everything we need to prove you are the rightful owners of this land and everything beneath it." Sheriff Barston stepped forward menacingly. "You're filling these people's heads with dangerous ideas, getting them hopes up for things that'll never happen." Seth moved protectively closer to Joe. "The only dangerous thing here is letting thieves steal what belongs to honest families." The confrontation was interrupted when Crawford Thorne himself entered the church, flanked by his associates. His eyes swept the gathered crowd with calculating coldness. "I understand there's been some confusion about property values," he said smoothly. "Perhaps I can clarify a few things." Crawford Thorne surveyed the church with the confidence of a man accustomed to controlling rooms full of people. His polished boots clicked against the wooden floor as he approached the table where Joe's evidence lay spread out. "Impressive collection of old documents," he said, his tone dismissive. "Though I'm afraid legal ownership is more complicated than sentimental attachments to family land." Joe stepped protectively between Thorne and the documents. These aren't sentimental attachments. They're proof of fraud. Thorne's smile never wavered. Strong accusations require strong proof, Mrs. Hargrove. I trust you have legal expertise to back up such claims. She has me. The voice came from the church doorway, where a tall man in a travel-worn suit stood holding a leather briefcase. Samuel Morrison, territorial land rights attorney. I've reviewed Mrs. Hargrove's preliminary evidence. Quite compelling. Joe felt relief flood through her. Morrison's arrival was earlier than expected, but perfectly timed. She had been corresponding with him for weeks, building a case through careful documentation. Thorne's confidence flickered for the first time. Mr. Morrison, I wasn't aware the territorial government had interest in local property transactions. The territorial government has great interest in systematic land fraud, Morrison replied, entering the church fully, especially when it involves forged deeds and fraudulent transfers spanning 2 decades. The crowd stirred with new energy. Having a federal attorney present transformed their gathering from a community meeting into something far more serious. Morrison approached the evidence table, ignoring Thorne's presence. Mrs. Hargrove, you mentioned additional documentation in your last letter. Joe nodded, producing a thick folder she had kept hidden. Original homestead patents for every property in the township, filed with the Territorial Land Office between 1823 and 1834. She spread the documents out methodically. Each patent bore the territorial seal and detailed property descriptions that matched current family holdings. The papers were yellowed with age but legally unassailable. These patents predate every Millfield Holdings transaction by at least 15 years, Morrison observed. Original land grants cannot be superseded by subsequent fraudulent transfers. Thorne's associates whispered urgently in his ear. His smooth facade was cracking as he realized the scope of Joe's investigation. Furthermore, Joe continued, I've documented the pattern of fraudulent transfers. Families were told they were signing tax documents or loan papers. The actual deeds transferring ownership were never shown to them. She produced a second folder containing copies of the fraudulent documents, alongside witness statements she had collected during her house visits. Martha Washington gasped as she recognized her own signature on a paper she had never seen before. I remember that man, Martha said, pointing to a notary seal. Told me it was just paperwork for the county assessor. Never said nothing about selling my land. Similar recognition rippled through the crowd. Family after family identified their signatures on documents they had been tricked into signing. Morrison examined each piece of evidence with professional thoroughness. This represents one of the most systematic land fraud schemes I've encountered. The federal government will definitely pursue criminal charges. Thorne finally abandoned his diplomatic approach. You people don't understand what you're refusing. Millfield Holdings offers fair compensation for properties that have limited value. Fight this, and you might end up with nothing. Nothing? Seth stepped forward, holding up the silver ore sample. This came from a test shaft on my property. The geological surveys show deposits running beneath half the township. We're not talking about limited value. Silver claims are speculative, Thorne countered. Legal ownership is not. Neither is fraud, Morrison replied sharply. Mrs. Hargrove's evidence shows clear criminal activity. Millfield Holdings has no legitimate claim to any of these properties. Joe felt the tide turning decisively in their favor. Weeks of careful investigation had built an unshakable foundation of evidence, but she knew Thorne wouldn't surrender easily. There's more, she announced, producing a final document that made Thorne's face go pale. Correspondence between Millfield Holdings and local officials discussing the fraudulent transfer scheme. Sheriff Barston moved toward the door, but Morrison's sharp voice stopped him. Sheriff, I believe you'll want to hear this. Joe read from a letter dated 3 years earlier. It detailed payments to local officials for facilitating fraudulent land transfers and suppressing any investigations into property ownership questions. Your cooperation in maintaining current ownership arrangements has been invaluable, Joe quoted. The enclosed compensation reflects our appreciation for your discretion. The church erupted in angry voices. Families realized that their own sheriff had been complicit in stealing their land. Barston's face flushed red as he became the target of 23 pairs of furious eyes. "You sold us out," Tom Donnelly said, his voice thick with betrayal. "Helped them steal everything we worked for." Morrison took control of the increasingly volatile situation. "This is now a federal investigation. Sheriff Barston, you're relieved of duties pending a full inquiry. Mr. Thorne, you and your associates will remain in town until formal charges are filed." Thorne made one final attempt to salvage his scheme. "Even if you challenge the land transfers, developing silver claims requires capital and expertise you don't possess. Millfield Holdings can offer partnership arrangements that benefit everyone." "Partnership?" Martha Washington's voice cut through the room like a blade. "You mean more contracts we can't read, more lies about what we're signing?" Joe stepped forward, addressing the entire gathering. "We don't need Millfield Holdings. The federal attorney has connections with honest mining companies, companies that will work with us as equal partners, not as marks to be cheated." Morrison nodded. "Legitimate mining operations are eager to work with communities that hold clear title to mineral rights. Fair partnerships that benefit local residents, not distant investors." The transformation in the room was remarkable. An hour earlier, these families had felt powerless against forces beyond their understanding. Now they stood unified against a conspiracy that had tried to rob them of their heritage. Thorne gathered his associates, his defeat evident in every movement. "This isn't over. Legal challenges take years. You'll be fighting in courts you can't afford." "Actually," Morrison smiled, "territorial law provides for full legal costs to be recovered from parties found guilty of systematic fraud. Millfield Holdings will be paying for their own prosecution." As Thorne and his men left the church, Joe felt Seth's hand find hers. The partnership that had begun with shared documents had evolved into something deeper and more permanent. "One question remains," Morrison addressed the gathering. "You'll need local leadership during this legal process, someone to coordinate with federal authorities and manage community interests." Every eye in the room turned toward Joe. The woman they had once dismissed now held their future in her capable hands. The vote was unanimous. Joe Hargrove would represent Millbrook's families in their fight against Millfield Holdings. As hands raised throughout the church, she felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders alongside an unexpected sense of rightness. Morrison spent 3 more days in town, documenting evidence and filing preliminary charges with the territorial court. His presence transformed the community's confidence. Children who had been quiet during the initial meeting now played loudly in the streets, sensing their parents' renewed hope. "Federal marshals will arrive next week to make formal arrests," Morrison informed Joe as he prepared to leave. "Thorne and his associates are confined to the hotel until then. Sheriff Barston is already in custody." Joe nodded, reviewing the legal documents Morrison had prepared. Her name appeared on multiple forms as official community representative. The weight of those signatures represented trust she had never expected to earn. "The mining partnership agreements look favorable," she said, studying the proposed contracts. 60% community ownership, 40% to the mining company. "Honest terms," Morrison confirmed. "Colorado Mining Consortium has an excellent reputation. They've worked successfully with other communities in similar situations." Seth approached as Morrison's carriage pulled away. The transformation in her husband over the past month had been remarkable. The bitter, drunk cowboy had evolved into a thoughtful partner who supported her leadership without resentment. "Town council wants to meet tonight," he said. "Discuss the mining operations and how to distribute the profits fairly." Joe smiled. Millbrook had never had a formal town council before. The crisis had created new institutions along with new leadership. Any resistance to the cooperative structure None. People remember how close they came to losing everything. Seth paused, studying her face. You realize what you've accomplished here. This community will never be the same. The mining operations began 6 weeks later. Colorado Mining Consortium arrived with equipment and expertise, but also with respect for the community's ownership rights. Local men found employment at wages that transformed family fortunes overnight. Joe established the Millbrook Community Trust to manage mineral revenues. Every family received equal shares based on property ownership and years of residency. The fund also supported community improvements, a proper school, medical clinic, and expanded church. The school was Joe's particular pride. She had insisted on integrated education for all children regardless of race or family background. The hired teacher, Miss Catherine Walsh, shared Joe's belief that intelligence knew no social boundaries. Reading, writing, arithmetic, and critical thinking, Joe explained to parents at the school's opening ceremony. Every child deserves tools to make informed decisions about their future. Elma Griffin approached after the ceremony, her transformation as dramatic as anyone's. The once timid woman now served as the trust's treasurer, her mathematical skills proving invaluable in managing community funds. Hard to believe this all started with folks laughing at your marriage, Elma said. Now look at what you've built. Joe glanced across the schoolyard where Seth was helping children with a reading lesson. Their partnership had evolved into genuine love, built on mutual respect and shared purpose. The marriage that began as punishment had become the foundation of everything good in her life. The legal proceedings concluded 4 months after Morrison's first visit. Millfield Holdings faced criminal charges in territorial court. Thorne received a 5-year prison sentence for fraud. Sheriff Barston lost his position and faced civil penalties for corruption. More importantly, every family's land ownership was legally confirmed. The fraudulent transfers were voided, and clear titles were issued for all properties. The silver belonged to the people who had worked the land for generations. Joe stood in the same church where she had first presented evidence against Millfield Holdings. This time, the gathering was celebratory. Families dressed in their finest clothes, many purchased with mining profits, filled every pew. Morrison had returned for the final legal proceedings. He addressed the community with obvious satisfaction. This case will serve as precedent for other fraud investigations across the territory. Your courage in fighting back has protected countless other families. The celebration continued into the evening with music and dancing in the town square. Joe found herself surrounded by people who had once whispered cruel comments about her marriage. Now they sought her advice on education, business decisions, and community planning. Seth appeared at her side, carrying 2 cups of lemonade. Remember when you said this wasn't permanent, that I'd figure something else out? Joe laughed, recalling his words from their wedding night. I remember thinking you were the most foolish man I'd ever met. What do you think now? She considered the question seriously. Seth had supported her leadership even when it challenged traditional expectations. He had defended her against prejudice and celebrated her successes without jealousy. I think losing that poker game was the smartest thing you ever did. They walked together toward their ranch house, visible in the distance with lamplight glowing warmly in the windows. The property that had once seemed like a burden now felt like home. Behind them, Millbrook continued its celebration. The community that had once been divided by fear and prejudice now stood united by shared prosperity and mutual respect. Children played games that crossed racial lines. Families made plans that extended generations into the future. Joe paused at their front gate, looking back at the town lights. A year ago, she had been dismissed as an unmarriageable woman with no prospects. Tonight, she was the architect of her community's transformation. Any regrets? Seth asked, following her gaze toward town. Joe smiled, thinking of all the lives that had changed because a desperate cowboy lost a bet and married a woman others had written off. The humiliation had become triumph. The punishment had become blessing. The unwanted wife had become the leader who saved them all. Not a single one. The lamplight in their windows beckoned them home, toward a future neither had imagined but both had earned through courage, intelligence, and the unexpected power of partnership built on genuine respect.